I have been to funerals, and I have been to memorials, and I have been to the hollow kind of evening where people stand in their best clothes and say careful things about someone they loved, and none of it gets anywhere near the truth. I thought the night they held the memorial for old Edmund Calloway, the tailor the best in 3 counties, dead at 79, would be that kind of evening. I was wrong. Edmund and I had been friends for 51 years. I built furniture. He built garments. We understood each other across the grain. Two men who worked with their hands and didn't feel the need to explain it. I was in the third row of the Civic Hall, a little to the right of center, a spot I'd chosen because it let me see the stage and also the door, in case I needed air. The hall was full. Edmund had made things for half the town, wedding suits, christening gowns, the coat the mayor wore to every public occasion for the better part of a decade. They were all there. The Brentford family in the second row, 3 generations of them. Old Mrs. Hapwell near the aisle, who Edmund had fitted for 40 years. The current mayor, Gerald Staines, and his wife in the front, both in dark wool. And somewhere near the back, I noticed her when she came in, Mira Calloway, Edmund's only daughter. 27 years old, quietly built, the kind of young woman who moves through a room without demanding anything from it. She had been running the tailor shop since her father's decline. She could stitch as well as he had, people said, though she never advertised it. She sat 2 rows from the back, with her coat folded on her lap, and she looked at the stage with the measured composure of someone who had spent 7 years practicing it. The program was respectable. The vicar spoke first, brief and warm, better than most. Then 2 of Edmund's former clients said a few words, and both of them were genuine, and both of them fell just short of the thing they were reaching for. There was a small upright piano on the left side of the stage, brought in for the occasion, though I hadn't heard who was to play it or when. By the time the third speaker had finished, the hall had acquired that particular stillness that isn't peace exactly, but rather a collective holding of breath, the way a room feels when it has absorbed as much measured sentiment as it can hold and is waiting, without knowing what it's waiting for. It was a child who broke it. A small boy, 7 or 8, sitting near the aisle in the 4th row, leaned too far sideways and knocked the stand beside him, a folding music stand someone had placed there, and the sheets on it scattered to the floor in a soft white rush. His mother went red and reached for him. Several people turned, and in the back of the room, Mira stood up. She came down the aisle quietly, collected the pages from the floor, handed them to the woman beside the stand with a murmured word. She would have returned to her seat. I believe she intended to. But as she straightened up, she was standing directly beside the piano, and her right hand, almost without her guidance, rested on the edge of the fallboard. It was Mrs. Hapwell who said it. 81 years old, 10 rows back, and she had a carrying voice when she chose to use it. Not unkind, just plain. "Do you play, dear?" The hall heard her. Heads turned toward Mira. Mira stood with her hand on the piano and said nothing for a moment. Then she sat down. I don't think anyone was certain, in those first seconds, what they were about to hear. I wasn't. I watched her settle on the bench, watched her look at the keys, the way you look at something you haven't seen in a long time. Not estranged from it, exactly, but careful. The way you might look at an old letter you weren't sure you were ready to read. She set her hands on the keys and was still. The first notes were quiet, tentative, almost. A simple melodic phrase, 4 bars, played at half the speed it seemed to want. And then she played it again, and this time it settled into itself, and I felt it before I understood it. I had heard that phrase before. Not at a concert, not on a recording. I had heard Edmund Calloway hum it, in his workroom 40 years ago, bending over a jacket lapel with a pin in his teeth, and that low, wandering hum that he made when the work was going well. I had never known it was a song. I had thought it was just his mind turning over. It was a song, and she had written it. She played it 3 times through, each time fuller than the left hand finding the shape beneath it. And by the third pass, the melody wasn't tentative anymore. It was unhurried and clear, the way a truth is clear when you finally say it out loud. I looked at the Brentford family in the second row. The grandmother had put both hands in her lap and was very still. The mayor's wife had bowed her head. Then, without pause, without announcement, Mira moved into something else. And I knew this one. Schubert, the impromptu in B-flat, Op. 142, the third one. Edmund had loved it. He used to say it was the piece that understood that some things were too large for words, and so it just played around them. I hadn't heard it in years. I hadn't expected to hear it here. Tonight, worked into this evening as naturally as thread into cloth. What she did with it was not a performance in the formal sense. There was no virtuosic display, no held notes pressed for effect. It was something quieter than that, and for that very reason, something larger. The phrasing was unhurried. She let the Schubert breathe, let each phrase complete itself before the next arrived, as though she had all the time she needed, and the room did too. She played it as though she were in conversation, the Schubert answering the melody she'd composed, and the melody answering back, the two of them woven together in the way that only works when both halves belong to the same feeling. And the feeling was this: I knew you. I knew you completely, and I will carry you. I became aware, slowly, that something was happening in the hall. Corbin Aldgate was in the second row, end seat, leftmost. He was 80 years old, had been Edmund's client since before I knew either of them, and he was the kind of man who maintained his dignity through all circumstances as a matter of personal policy. I had seen him at funerals. I had seen him at the bedsides of dying men. I had never seen his face do what it was doing now, the jaw working slightly, the eyes bright and then brighter, and then the slow, helpless track of a tear down one cheek which he didn't wipe away. He let it go. He sat with it and let it go. Gerald Staines, the mayor, in the front row, turned to his wife without speaking, and she took his hand, and they stayed like that for the rest of it. Near the back, 2 rows ahead of where Mira had been sitting, an older woman I didn't recognize had her eyes closed and her head tilted slightly, the way people do when they are listening to music that is going somewhere inside them that they had forgotten existed. No one spoke. No one shifted. No one left. The hall, which had spent the whole evening holding itself carefully apart from its own grief, as though grief were a thing that must be managed and not felt, had simply given way. Not broken, not collapsed, just released. The way a room releases when someone finally opens a window. The Schubert moved through its middle passage, and Mira played it without ornament, without hurry, with only the one quality that matters and cannot be learned, the quality of meaning it absolutely. And underneath it, threading through like a low voice, was her father's melody, his workroom hum. The thing he had carried through 50 years of careful work and never known was beautiful. She brought the 2 pieces to rest together, the Schubert resolving, the melody folding into the final chord, which she held until the sound had given everything it had, and there was nothing left but the silence that a hall makes when it has stopped breathing, and then the silence after that, which is something else entirely. I was aware that my hands were pressed flat against my knees. I did not know when I had put them there. Someone at the back began to applaud. Then the whole hall, rising, not the sharp, bright applause of a performance well executed, but the slower, fuller kind, the kind that is also acknowledgement, that says, yes, that was the thing, that was what we came here for, and did not know how to name until just now. Mira sat for a moment with her hands still on the keys. Then she rose, turned to face the hall with the same quietness she had carried all evening, and gave a small, composed nod. She walked back to her row and sat down. She folded her hands on her coat. If she was undone, she had chosen to be undone in private, and I respected that entirely. Edmund Calloway, for 50 years, built things for other people and hummed to himself while he did it. He never told anyone, as far as I knew, that the humming was anything. He left it to his daughter to say what it was. And his daughter came to a civic hall on a cold evening and sat at a borrowed piano and played it into the room where all of his people were gathered, and the room understood. I have been to funerals, and I have been to memorials, and I have been to the hollow kind of evening that only grazes the surface of what it was trying to touch. I have once been to the other kind. I know now what makes the difference. It is not the right words, spoken carefully. It is the willingness to play the note that was never played in time, and trust that the room will hear it for what it is. I drove home that night in silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not want anything else in my ears.